When the Johnson family arrived at the farm, the first thing they noticed was the gate. Rusted and barely clinging to its hinges, it stood as both a barrier and a warning, its jagged edges a reminder of time's slow erosion. The farm, inherited from a distant relative no one remembered meeting, had been a surprise, a gift that came with no explanation, no paperwork, and no contact from the lawyer who'd announced its transfer. For the Johnsons, it was an opportunity to escape their cramped suburban life and start fresh. They had no idea what waited for them beyond that gate. The farmhouse itself was a sprawling relic of another era. Its peeling white paint and sagging roof betrayed decades of neglect, but something about its symmetry suggested it had once been grand. Ivy clung to the walls, its tendrils snaking into broken windows. A lone rocking chair sat on the porch, facing out toward the overgrown fields. It moved slightly in the wind, or so they assumed. The air was still that afternoon, and the oppressive quiet seemed to press against their ears, as if the world was holding its breath. The fields stretched endlessly, an ocean of wheat rippling under the dull, gray sky. Yet, the closer they looked, the less natural it seemed. The wheat stood too tall, unnervingly straight, as if each stalk had been placed deliberately. The wind carried a faint, sweet scent that felt out of place, like decaying flowers left too long in water. Frank Johnson, the patriarch, reassured his family that it was probably just fertilizer. His wife, Sarah, nodded absently, her eyes fixed on a distant scarecrow standing sentinel in the middle of the field. From the moment they stepped onto the land, the youngest Johnson, Lily, felt uneasy. At 7 years old, she had a sensitivity her parents often dismissed as an overactive imagination. But as she followed her father across the threshold of the gate, she tugged on his sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, the gate feels angry." Frank laughed it off, though he couldn't deny the unsettling groan it made as he pushed it open. His hand came away streaked with red-orange rust that looked too much like dried blood. The family spent the first hour exploring the farmhouse. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew. The furniture was still intact, covered in white sheets like forgotten ghosts. In the living room, a massive stone fireplace dominated the space, its blackened interior hinting at fires long extinguished. On the mantel, a series of faded photographs displayed faces that seemed familiar, though none of the Johnsons could place why. Sarah pointed to one of a stern-looking man in overalls. Maybe that's Uncle Edgar, she guessed, though the name sounded as foreign to her as the rest of the farm felt. In the kitchen, they found a pantry stocked with jars of preserved food, each labeled in delicate handwriting that had long since faded. The labels weren't written in English or any language they could recognize. Lily reached for one of the jars, a dark, syrupy liquid sloshing inside, but Sarah pulled her back. "Not until we know what it is," she scolded, though her voice trembled. Sarah couldn't explain why, but the jars felt wrong, like they were watching her. Outside, Frank decided to inspect the barn while Sarah and Lily unpacked. The barn loomed in the distance, its weathered boards warped and splintered, but it stood tall against the horizon. As he approached, he noticed a peculiar smell, something earthy yet metallic. The heavy doors creaked open to reveal rows of tools hanging neatly on the walls, each one polished and gleaming despite the barn's decay. A tractor sat in the corner, covered in dust, but seemingly functional. Yet what caught his eye most was the floor. The dirt beneath his boots was oddly smooth, as if freshly tilled, and in the center was a large, dark stain that no amount of dust could hide. Meanwhile, Lily wandered to the edge of the fields despite her mother's protests. The scarecrow, she realized, wasn't just standing. It was slumped, its burlap head tilted to one side as if it had been broken. Its button eyes stared directly at her, and though she knew it was impossible, she swore it was smiling. She turned to call for her mother, but stopped when she noticed something glinting in the dirt near her feet. It was a small, rusted key, jagged and cold to the touch. She slipped it into her pocket without telling anyone. By sunset, the family had settled in, though the unease lingered like a shadow in the back of their minds. They gathered in the living room to discuss their plans for the farm. trying to ignore the strange creaks and groans of the old house. Outside, the wheat swayed unnaturally, the scarecrow now barely visible against the darkening sky. It seemed closer than before, though no one had touched it. That night, Lily had trouble sleeping. She lay in bed, clutching the keys she'd found, and stared at the window. The faint outline of the scarecrow was still visible from her room. She blinked, and for a moment, she thought it had moved. Her small hand reached for the lamp, but before she could turn it on, a low, guttural whisper filled the room. It sounded like her name, and then silence. The next morning broke with a pale, sickly light that barely filtered through the gray clouds. The Johnson family awoke groggy and uneasy. Lily was the last to leave her room, her wide eyes scanning the fields beyond her window as if searching for something. The scarecrow, she noted, was no longer visible. She didn't mention it to her parents. Breakfast in the farmhouse kitchen was a strange affair. The air felt heavy, the walls too quiet. The family ate in near silence, interrupted only by the occasional clink of cutlery on their mismatched plates. Frank tried to lighten the mood with idle talk of repairs needed on the barn roof, but even he couldn't deny the oppressive weight in the room. The farmhouse, with its sagging walls and faintly sloping floors, seemed to be watching them. When Frank finally stepped outside to begin work, he noticed something peculiar. The wheat field, which had swayed in eerie synchronization the previous night, now stood eerily still. Not a single stalk moved, even though a faint breeze teased the edges of the porch. The unnatural stillness made the back of his neck prickle, but he shook it off. Just the wind playing tricks, he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Lily, meanwhile, had taken it upon herself to explore. She wandered near the edge of the fields, where the wheat seemed to hum faintly, a low vibration she could feel in her bones. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but as she stepped closer, the hum sharpened into something more distinct, a whisper. Her name, repeated softly, carried on a voice that wasn't quite human. She froze in place, the rusted key in her pocket suddenly feeling heavier. Sarah found Lily standing motionless near the wheat and called her back to the house. "Don't wander too far," she warned. "We don't know this place yet." Lily didn't argue, but kept glancing over her shoulder as they walked back. She could still hear it, the faint whisper that now felt like a plea. As the day wore on, Frank busied himself with the barn, hammering loose boards into place and clearing out debris. Inside, he found an old trunk buried under a pile of moldy hay. The lock was broken, and the lid creaked as he pried it open. Inside were faded documents, handwritten letters, and an old, leather-bound journal. He flipped through its pages, his brow furrowing at the cryptic scrawl of words. Most of it was illegible, but one phrase repeated frequently enough to stand out. "The soil remembers." Back at the house, Sarah tackled the kitchen, scrubbing years of grime from the countertops and clearing out the strange jars in the pantry. As she reached for a particularly large jar filled with a dark, viscous liquid, it slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. The liquid spread across the tiles, releasing a rancid smell that made her gag. For a moment, she thought she saw something moving in the puddle, but when she blinked, it was gone. She cleaned it up hastily, her hands trembling. By late afternoon, the family regrouped. Frank shared the journal with Sarah, who examined it with growing unease. "This doesn't make sense," she said, flipping through its brittle pages. "It's like someone was trying to document something, but they were too terrified to finish." The faint scrawls of sketches dotted the margins. Figures with elongated limbs and hollow faces, etched in frantic, trembling lines. As the sun began to dip behind the horizon, the whispers grew louder. This time Sarah heard them too. She stepped onto the porch and stared at the fields. The wheat seemed alive now, swaying in deliberate patterns that defied the stillness of the air. "Frank," she called, her voice tight. "Come look at this." Frank joined her, and they both stood in silence, watching the unnatural movement. The wheat parted slightly, as if something were moving through it, though no figure was visible. Lily, standing behind them, clutched the key in her pocket and whispered, "It's coming closer." That night, no one slept. The whispers didn't fade. They grew louder, circling the house like a wind that carried voices from another world. The Johnson family sat in the living room, their eyes darting to every creak of the old house. Outside, the wheat whispered secrets they couldn't understand. And somewhere in the darkness, the scarecrow waited. The next morning dawned colder than it should have for late summer. Frost clung to the windows, an impossible phenomenon that Sarah noticed the moment she stepped into the kitchen. She wiped at the glass with her sleeve, revealing a faint outline in the distance, a silhouette standing at the edge of the field. Her breath caught in her throat. The scarecrow had returned. It hadn't been there yesterday, Sarah was certain. Yet now it stood tall, its burlap face tilted unnervingly, as though it were watching the house. Its tattered clothing fluttered in a breeze that Sarah couldn't feel. The jagged stalks of wheat seemed to lean toward it, as if drawn by some unseen force. She quickly closed the curtain and turned back to the stove, trying to focus on making breakfast. But her hands trembled so much she spilled the coffee grounds. When Frank joined her in the kitchen, she whispered about the scarecrow. "I swear it wasn't there before," she said, her voice barely audible. Frank frowned and peered out the window. He squinted but saw nothing unusual. "It's just a scarecrow," he replied, trying to sound reassuring, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed his unease. "We're letting this place get to us?" Lily, however, knew better. She hadn't stopped thinking about the whispers or the strange key she had found. As she sat at the breakfast table, she fingered the jagged metal in her pocket, feeling a peculiar warmth radiating from it. The whispers had been louder last night, almost insistent. They seemed to know she had the key. She glanced at her parents, who were arguing softly about the scarecrow, and decided not to tell them about the voices. Not yet. Later that morning, Frank ventured back into the barn, determined to finish his repairs. The dark stain on the floor caught his eye again. He knelt to inspect it more closely, running his fingers over the soil. It wasn't just a stain, it was damp, and when he brought his hand closer to his face, the unmistakable coppery scent of blood filled his nostrils. He stumbled backward, his stomach lurching. "It's just the soil," he muttered to himself, echoing the journal's cryptic refrain. But the words rang hollow. Meanwhile, Sarah decided to confront her fear of the scarecrow. She grabbed a pair of binoculars from the living room and stepped onto the porch. The fields were eerily still, the wheat frozen in place as though caught mid-breath. She raised the binoculars and focused on the scarecrow. What she saw made her blood run cold. Its head wasn't made of burlap, as she'd thought. It was something else entirely. The texture was too fleshy, too human, and its button eyes seemed wet, as if they had once been real. Sarah staggered back inside, slamming the door behind her. She told herself it couldn't be true, that her imagination was running wild. But deep down, she knew she wasn't mistaken. She thought of the photographs in the living room, of the stern-faced man in overalls. For a moment, the scarecrow's tilted head and long, slender limbs had reminded her of him. By late afternoon, Lily had wandered off again, drawn by the pull of the wheat field. She stood at its edge, clutching the key tightly. The whispers had grown clearer now, forming fragmented sentences. "The gate. Open it. Let it breathe." Her heart raced, but she didn't move. The key felt impossibly heavy in her hand, as though it were alive. She took a cautious step toward the field, but just then, her mother's voice called her back. The whispers vanished instantly. That evening, the family gathered in the living room, the oppressive silence stretching between them. Frank sat with the journal in his lap, flipping through its pages, while Sarah stared out the window, her fingers twitching anxiously. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, the key hidden behind her back. Outside, the darkness deepened, and the silhouette of the scarecrow seemed to grow taller, its outline faintly illuminated by the moonlight. At midnight, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't confined to the fields. They echoed through the house, weaving through the walls and into the creaking floorboards. The family huddled together, the air in the room growing colder with every passing second. Lily swore she saw her breath fog in front of her, even though the windows were shut tight. And then came a sound, It started as a soft scraping like nails dragging across wood. It grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Something or someone was moving across the porch. The creaking of the old rocking chair followed, a slow, deliberate rhythm that made Sarah's skin crawl. Frank grabbed a flashlight and opened the front door, determined to face whatever it was. But when he stepped outside, the porch was empty. The rocking chair was still, its runners resting silently against the wooden boards. He swept the flashlight across the field and froze. The scarecrow was gone. When he turned back to the house, his blood ran cold. The door was ajar, and the whispers were louder inside. Frank stood on the porch, the flashlight trembling in his hands. The whispers inside the house had taken on an eerie, resonant quality, like voices carried on a distant wind that somehow penetrated the walls. He took a cautious step toward the door, his mind racing. The scarecrow was gone, but where could it have gone? And how? Inside the house, Sarah and Lily sat frozen in the living room. The air had grown oppressively cold, each breath visible as pale clouds against the dim light of the oil lamp. The whispers had begun to form recognizable words, disjointed and haunting. It hungers the soil, the key. The last word made Lily stiffen. She clutched the old key in her pocket tighter, her small hand slick with sweat despite the cold. Frank finally stepped inside, his boots creaking on the warped floorboards. He closed the door behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. "It's gone," he said, his voice strained. "The scarecrow, it's not there anymore." Sarah turned to him, her face pale. "What do you mean it's gone?" "I don't know," Frank replied, running a hand through his hair. "It's just not there. But something's wrong, I think." He stopped mid-sentence, staring at the floor. The faint stain that had appeared earlier now stretched into the house, a dark, glistening line that snaked its way toward the living room. It was as though the soil itself had bled into their home. The family followed the trail with their eyes as it disappeared beneath the rug. Frank knelt and pulled the rug aside, revealing something that hadn't been there before: a series of wooden planks arranged in a haphazard circle. The wood was darker than the rest of the floor, as if scorched, and faint carvings were etched into its surface. Lily's eyes widened. The markings were almost identical to the strange designs on the key. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "This house, this place, it's not right." Frank, always the skeptic, tried to rationalize it. "Old houses settle in strange ways," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "This is just some weird woodwork from the previous owners." But as he reached out to touch the circle, a low groan echoed through the house. It sounded like wood bending, but deeper, more organic. The walls seemed to shudder, and the lamp on the side table flickered violently. Sarah jumped to her feet, pulling Lily close. "What is happening?" she cried. The groaning sound grew louder, accompanied by rhythmic creaks, as though the house itself were breathing. Then came the knock. It wasn't from the front door or the back, but from somewhere deep beneath them. 3 loud, deliberate thuds that reverberated through the floorboards. Lily gasped and stepped back, her eyes fixed on the circle. "It's coming from there," she said, her voice trembling. Frank grabbed a crowbar from the corner of the room, his face grim. "If there's something under this floor, I'm going to find out what it is." Sarah begged him to stop, but he ignored her, driven by a mix of fear and determination. He wedged the crowbar into the planks and began to pry them loose. The first board came up with a groan, revealing dark, compacted earth beneath it. Frank hesitated, then continued. With each board he removed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. By the time he pulled up the last one, the family stared in horror. Beneath the planks was a deep, gaping hole, its edges lined with roots that seemed to pulse faintly, like veins. The whispers surged, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. From the depths of the hole, something moved. A faint, wet sound echoed upward, like flesh dragging against stone. Sarah screamed, pulling Lily behind her. Frank staggered back, dropping the crowbar as a skeletal hand emerged, its bony fingers clawing at the edge of the pit. It was followed by a second hand, and then the beginning of a face, elongated, eyeless, and covered in pale, leathery skin. "Get out!" Sarah screamed. "We have to get out!" Frank, paralyzed by fear, could only stare as the creature began to pull itself upward. Lily, clutching the key, felt an overwhelming compulsion to move closer. The whispers in her mind grew deafening, demanding, "The key, bring it." Before anyone could stop her, Lily stepped forward, holding the key aloft. The creature paused, its head tilting toward her despite its lack of eyes. Its skeletal mouth opened, releasing a guttural sound that reverberated through the house. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. The family stood frozen as Lily placed the key on the edge of the hole. The creature reached out, its claw-like hand hovering over the key for a moment before snatching it. As soon as it did, the house shuddered violently. The walls groaned, and a deafening roar filled the air. The family scrambled for the door, stumbling out into the cold night as the house behind them seemed to collapse inward, as though consumed by the earth itself. They stood in the yard, panting and shaking, as the house disappeared into the ground, leaving nothing but an empty patch of soil where it had stood. The whispers were gone, but the silence that replaced them was far more terrifying. And in the distance, at the edge of the wheat field, the scarecrow reappeared, its burlap face turned toward them, its empty button eyes glinting faintly in the moonlight. The collapse of the house left the family stunned, staring at the barren patch of soil that had swallowed their home. The night sky loomed overhead, vast and indifferent, as if mocking their smallness. The scarecrow at the edge of the field stood sentinel, its hollow gaze unwavering. Frank, Sarah, and Lily shivered in the biting cold, their breath misting in the moonlight. None of them spoke for a long time. Lily finally broke the silence, her voice fragile. "It took the key." Her words hung in the air, carrying an unsettling weight. Frank turned to her, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "What key?" he asked sharply, though he already suspected the answer. Lily hesitated, then pulled her hands from her pockets to show they were empty. "The one I found in the barn." Frank's anger flared. "You found something and didn't tell us?" His voice cracked under the pressure of fear and exhaustion. Sarah placed a trembling hand on his arm, trying to calm him. "Frank, yelling won't help. We need to figure out what's going on." Her words sounded steady, but her eyes betrayed her terror. A rumbling sound beneath their feet interrupted the exchange. It was deep and resonant, like the growl of some enormous creature buried far below. The ground trembled slightly, enough to make them stumble. "What now?" Sarah whispered, clutching Lily tightly. Frank scanned the area with his flashlight, its beam shaky and uneven. He noticed something he hadn't seen before, a faint, circular indentation in the soil where the house had stood. It was impossibly large, spanning the entire footprint of the house, and from its center, a faint red glow began to emerge. Lily stepped forward, drawn inexplicably to the glow. "Lily, no!" Sarah called, grabbing her arm, but the girl's face was blank, her eyes wide and unblinking. "It's calling," Lily murmured, her voice devoid of emotion. Frank pulled her back forcefully, snapping her out of the trance. "We're not going anywhere near that," he said firmly. The glow grew brighter, illuminating strange symbols carved into the soil. They resembled the ones on the key and the planks from the floor, but these were larger, more intricate, and pulsated faintly as though alive. From the center of the circle, the soil began to shift and sink, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. The air around them grew warmer, tinged with the metallic scent of earth and decay. "We need to leave," Sarah said, panic rising in her voice. But Frank shook his head. "Leave and go where?" "The car's gone, the road's miles away, and we don't even know if we're safe out here." He glanced toward the staircase, his jaw tightening. "I think we need to go down. Whatever's happening here started under that house, and we need answers." Sarah looked at him as though he had gone mad. "Go down there? Are you insane? That thing came from below." Frank ignored her protests, grabbing a lantern from the shed and stepping toward the staircase. "You don't have to come, but I can't just stand here and wait for something worse to happen." Lily pulled away from her mother and moved to stand by her father. "I'll go with you," she said quietly. Sarah gasped, horrified. "Lily, no. You don't understand what's happening." The girl turned to her, her expression eerily calm. "I think I do. The key was part of it. I was part of it. I need to see what's down there." With no other options and fear of being left alone, Sarah reluctantly followed. The descent was slow and deliberate, each step creaking under their weight. The deeper they went, the warmer the air became, thick and oppressive like a humid summer night. The lantern cast long shadows on the curved walls, revealing more of the strange carvings that seemed to writhe when observed too closely. At the bottom of the staircase, they stepped into a cavernous chamber that defied logic. The walls were covered in twisting roots that pulsed with an otherworldly light, casting the room in a dim, red hue. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, its surface etched with the same symbols that had haunted them since they arrived. And on the altar sat the key. But the key was no longer an inert object. It floated above the altar, spinning slowly, surrounded by an aura of shifting light. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the cavern like 1,000 voices speaking at once. Sarah clutched her ears, trying to block them out, but Lily stepped forward, transfixed. "It's awake," she whispered. Frank grabbed Lily's arm, trying to pull her back, but the ground trembled violently. From the shadows beyond the altar, shapes began to emerge, tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as though they had been waiting for this moment for centuries. The family huddled together, trapped between the advancing figures and the glowing key. Frank looked at Sarah, his face pale and desperate. "We need to stop this," he said, though he had no idea how. The figures moved closer, their hollow eyes locked on Lily. And then, to their horror, the key began to spin faster, and the altar cracked open, revealing an abyss that pulsed with fiery light. As the ground began to crumble beneath their feet, the whispers coalesced into a single, booming voice that echoed through the chamber. "The gate has been opened. The offering is here." The air in the chamber thickened, pressing against the family like an unseen hand. Frank's instinct screamed to grab Sarah and Lily and run, but there was no escape. The abyss at the center of the altar widened, glowing brighter, its light pulsating like a heartbeat. The towering figures surrounding them moved in unison, their hollow eyes fixed on Lily as if drawn to her presence. Lily stared back, her expression vacant. She seemed entranced, standing rigid as though rooted to the floor. "They want me," she murmured, her voice so faint it was almost lost in the din of the whispers. Frank shook her violently by the shoulders. "No one is taking you. Snap out of it." But his words fell on deaf ears. She raised her hand, pointing at the abyss. "It's calling," she whispered again. Sarah clutched Frank's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We can't stay here. Whatever this is, it's alive." Her voice cracked with hysteria as the ground beneath them trembled. The cracks on the altar spread outward like creeping vines, and from the fissures emerged tendrils of dark, pulsating energy that snaked toward Lily. Frank reacted on instinct, grabbing one of the tendrils and yanking it away. His hand burned as if he'd plunged it into molten metal. He cried out, staggering backward and clutching his palm, which was now blistered and blackened. "Don't touch them," Sarah screamed, dragging Lily behind her. But Lily didn't resist. She walked forward, as if in a trance, slipping free from her mother's grip. "Lily, stop!" Sarah screamed, but the girl didn't turn. She stepped closer to the altar, her small silhouette dwarfed by the towering figures that watched her every move. Frank scrambled to his feet, his mind racing for a plan. He grabbed the lantern he had brought, its flickering light barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. Without thinking, he hurled it at the nearest figure. The lantern shattered on impact, dousing the figure in flames. For a moment, the cavern was bathed in fiery light, revealing the full extent of the horrors surrounding them. The walls pulsed with a sickly, organic rhythm, and the roots writhed like living things. The burning figure shrieked, a sound that was not human, and dissolved into ash. But the others did not react. They simply continued their slow advance, their focus still on Lily. The destruction of one figure seemed to enrage the chamber itself. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening cacophony that made it impossible to think. The abyss in the altar erupted, sending a wave of heat and light that knocked Sarah and Frank to the ground. Lily stood firm, her hair whipping around her face as if caught in an invisible storm. Then, the voice returned. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a roar that reverberated through the chamber, shaking the walls and sending debris raining from above. The offering must be made, it thundered. Lily's eyes, wide and unblinking, turned toward her parents. I have to go, she said simply, her tone eerily calm. No, Frank shouted, crawling toward her despite the searing heat emanating from the altar. We're leaving. Together. He reached for her, but one of the tendrils lashed out, wrapping around his wrist and pulling him back. He screamed in pain, the tendril burning into his flesh like acid. Sarah grabbed a piece of jagged rock and struck the tendril, severing it. Frank fell to the ground, gasping, as the severed piece dissolved into black smoke. The towering figures stepped closer, their movements growing more urgent. Sarah screamed, her voice raw and desperate. What do you want from us? The figures didn't respond, but the voice from the abyss did. The bloodline, the key, the door must open. Lily stepped closer to the altar, her small figure illuminated by the fiery glow. The tendrils reached for her, but stopped short, almost reverent. I think I understand, she said softly, her voice cutting through the chaos. It's been waiting for me. For someone like me. Frank forced himself to his feet, his injured hand hanging uselessly at his side. No, you don't understand anything, Lily. Whatever it's telling you, it's lying. Don't listen to it. He staggered forward, ignoring the tendrils that snapped at his legs. You're not going anywhere. But Lily turned to him, tears streaming down her face. Dad, I have to. If I don't, it'll take all of us. It's the only way. Her voice broke, and for a moment, she was just a frightened child again. I'm so scared. Frank lunged forward, grabbing her in a desperate embrace. I won't let you go, he sobbed. But the ground trembled violently, and the abyss roared, sending a shockwave that threw him and Sarah backward. They hit the ground hard, struggling to regain their footing as the towering figures began to close in. The last thing they saw before the light became blinding was Lily stepping onto the altar, her small figure swallowed by the fiery glow. The abyss roared again, louder than ever, as if in triumph. And then, with a deafening crack, the altar shattered, sending a wave of darkness through the chamber that extinguished the light and silenced the whispers. When the family opened their eyes, they were back outside, sprawled in the field beneath the cold night sky. The house was gone, the cavern was gone, and so was Lily. All that remained was the silence of the wind and the distant outline of the scarecrow, its hollow gaze fixed on them. The stillness that followed Lily's disappearance was unbearable. Frank and Sarah lay sprawled on the damp earth, stunned and disoriented. The cold night air cut through their clothes, but neither moved for what felt like hours. The haunting emptiness where their house had once stood yawned before them, a void that mirrored the hollow ache in their chests. Only the faint rustling of the wind broke the silence, carrying with it whispers too soft to decipher. Frank was the first to stir, his body aching as he pushed himself to his knees. His mind was a storm of guilt and disbelief. Lily was gone. His daughter, his flesh and blood, had vanished into the unknown, swallowed by a force he couldn't comprehend. The weight of his failure pressed down on him like an iron shackle. She's gone, he murmured, his voice cracking. She's really gone? Sarah sat up slowly, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Her gaze was fixed on the spot where the cavern entrance had been moments ago. It's not over, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. She's out there. Somewhere. We have to find her. Frank shook his head, his hands trembling. How? Did you see what happened? That thing took her. It's not something we can fight, Sarah. It's beyond us. Sarah's eyes flashed with anger and desperation. Don't you dare give up on her. She's our daughter, Frank. I don't care what it takes. We're getting her back." Her voice rose, echoing across the empty field. But the silence that followed swallowed her words, as if the world itself had no answer for her plea. The wind shifted, and with it came a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible giggle. Both parents froze, their eyes darting toward the source. It was distant, carried on the breeze, but unmistakable. It was Lily's laugh. Frank stood abruptly, scanning the darkness. "Did you hear that? That was her. She's close." He took a step forward, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Listen." The giggle came again, softer this time, and accompanied by a faint rustling sound. It seemed to come from the direction of the scarecrow, which loomed ominously in the field. Its silhouette was sharper now, more defined against the moonlight, and something about it felt wrong. Frank's stomach churned as he stared at it. Had the scarecrow always been so tall? Had its posture always been so human? Sarah tugged at his arm. "We need to go check," she said, her voice barely audible. Frank hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay away. But the sound of Lily's laugh, familiar yet distorted, spurred him into action. Together, they moved cautiously across the field, their footsteps crunching softly against the frost-kissed grass. As they approached the scarecrow, the details of its form became clearer, and with each step, their dread deepened. The burlap sack that made up its head seemed to shift subtly, as though it was watching them. Its arms, which were once rigid sticks, now hung at odd angles, the fingers, if they could be called that, appearing more like twisted roots than wood. And then there was its chest, the fabric there bulged unnaturally, as if something was writhing beneath it. Frank stopped a few feet away, his fists clenched. "This isn't real," he muttered to himself. "It's just a scarecrow." But as he spoke, the wind picked up, and the scarecrow's head turned ever so slightly, its empty eye sockets locking onto them. Sarah gasped, grabbing Frank's hand. "It moved," she whispered harshly. Before either of them could react further, the giggle came again, but this time it was louder, closer, and it was coming from the scarecrow itself. Frank's breath hitched as the bulge in its chest began to pulsate. Slowly, the fabric tore open, and from within emerged a hand, small and pale, like a child's. "Mommy," a voice whispered, and Frank and Sarah froze in horror. The voice was Lily's, but it was wrong, layered with an unnatural resonance that made their skin crawl. The hand reached out further, followed by a face that was unmistakably Lily's but twisted, her features warped as though reflected in a funhouse mirror. Sarah screamed, backing away, but Frank stood rooted to the spot. "Lily," he cried, his voice breaking. Is it really you?" The thing that looked like Lily tilted its head, smiling in a way that was both innocent and grotesque. "You left me," it said, its voice a chilling blend of accusation and amusement. "Why did you let them take me?" "I didn't," Frank shouted, tears streaming down his face. We didn't. We tried to save you." The figure climbed fully out of the scarecrow's chest, its movements jerky and unnatural. It took a step forward, its bare feet crunching against the frost. "You'll try harder this time," it said, the smile never leaving its face. Then it turned and pointed to the horizon, where the faint outline of a dark forest loomed. "Follow me." Without waiting for a response, it began to walk, its steps light but deliberate. Frank and Sarah exchanged a terrified glance. "We can't," Sarah whispered. "Frank, that's not her. That's not our daughter." Frank's jaw tightened. "I don't care what it is," he said, his voice firm despite his fear. "If there's even a chance it's her, I'm not letting her go again." And with that, he began to follow. Sarah hesitated for a moment before sighing and running after him. The figure didn't look back as it led them toward the dark forest. The wind grew colder, the whispers more persistent. The scarecrow remained behind, its empty sockets fixed on the horizon, as if watching them vanish into the shadows. The forest loomed before Frank and Sarah like the entrance to another world. The towering trees were unnaturally dark, their gnarled branches reaching skyward as if in silent agony. A faint mist curled at their base, clinging to the ground like a restless spirit. The figure that resembled Lily walked ahead, its small form moving with an eerie grace that made it impossible to look away. Each step it took seemed deliberate, as though it knew the way into the heart of the forest and what awaited them there. Frank clutched Sarah's hand tightly as they approached the tree line. His resolve to follow the figure hadn't wavered, but the oppressive energy radiating from the forest filled him with unease. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She glanced back at the field behind them, its frost-covered expanse, now feeling impossibly distant, as if they were already leaving reality behind. "I have to be," Frank replied, his voice hollow. He didn't look at her as he spoke, his eyes fixed on the figure ahead. "If that's Lily, if there's even a chance, it's worth the risk." As they crossed into the forest, the air grew heavier, as though the trees themselves were pressing in on them. The faint whispers that had haunted the wind now seemed to emanate from the forest itself, carried on the shifting mist. Words were indistinct, merging into an almost melodic cadence that was both mesmerizing and unnerving. The figure ahead paused and turned slightly, just enough for them to catch a glimpse of its face. It was still Lily, still wrong. Her eyes seemed larger now, too wide for her small face, and her smile stretched just a bit too far. "Hurry," it urged, its voice sweet yet unsettling. "They're waiting, they?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The words sent a chill down her spine, but the figure had already turned back, resuming its silent march deeper into the forest. The deeper they went, the less the forest resembled anything natural. The trees twisted in impossible directions, their bark covered in strange, glowing patterns that pulsed like veins. The ground beneath their feet felt spongy, and Sarah swore she saw it ripple as they walked. Occasionally, shapes flickered in the mist, figures that seemed to watch them from the edges of their vision, only to disappear when they turned to look directly. "This place," Sarah muttered, gripping Frank's arm tightly. "It's alive." Frank nodded but didn't respond. His focus was on Lily, or whatever was leading them. The further they walked, the harder it was to reconcile the creature with the daughter he knew. It looked like her, sounded like her, but something beneath the surface felt alien, malevolent. Still, he couldn't stop. Not yet. Suddenly, the figure halted. They had reached a clearing, the mist parting to reveal a circular space illuminated by an unnatural, silver light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. In the center stood a large, ancient tree unlike any they had seen before. Its bark was jet black, and its branches were bare, reaching out like skeletal fingers. Embedded in its trunk was a door, crudely carved and glowing faintly with the same patterns they had seen on the other trees. "This is the way," the figure said, turning to face them fully. Its wide eyes glinted in the eerie light, and its smile grew even wider, splitting its face unnaturally. "Beyond here, you'll find what you seek." Frank took a step forward, but Sarah pulled him back. "Wait," she said firmly, her eyes darting between him and the figure. "We don't know what's in there. What if it's a trap? What if it's not her?" Frank turned to her, his face etched with desperation. "And what if it is? What if she's in there, waiting for us to save her?" "I can't," his voice cracked, and he shook his head. "I can't just walk away." The figure tilted its head, watching them with an almost amused expression. "It's not for you to decide," it said, its voice taking on a darker tone. "The door calls. You will enter." As if in response, the door in the tree began to hum, the glowing patterns intensifying. The air around them grew colder, and the whispers became louder, forming words that Frank and Sarah couldn't quite understand. The figure stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "Go," it said simply. Frank hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. Sarah clung to his arm, her grip trembling but firm. Together, they approached the door, its surface radiating an unnatural heat that seemed to seep into their skin. Frank reached out, his hand hovering just above the glowing wood. "Wait," Sarah said again, her voice shaking. "What if we can't come back?" Frank met her gaze, his eyes filled with both fear and determination. "We have to try," he said, Then, before either of them could second-guess, he placed his hand on the door. The moment his palm made contact, the forest erupted in chaos. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices screaming in unison. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the mist swirled violently around them. The door began to open, its surface splitting apart with a low, guttural groan that reverberated through the clearing. Beyond the door was darkness, complete, suffocating darkness that seemed to pulse like a living thing. For a moment, Frank and Sarah hesitated, staring into the abyss. Then the figure behind them giggled, the sound distorted and echoing unnaturally. "It's too late now," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You're already theirs." Before they could react, a powerful force pulled them forward, dragging them into the void. The door slammed shut behind them with a final, resounding thud, leaving the clearing silent once more. Only the ancient tree remained, its glowing patterns fading back into stillness. Frank and Sarah awoke in a suffocating darkness that seemed to press against their skin like a living thing. The air was dense, carrying a faint metallic tang that burned their throats with every breath. There was no up, no down, only an oppressive, endless void that stretched in every direction. The door that had sealed them inside was gone, leaving them stranded in a space that felt neither natural nor man-made. Panic gripped Sarah first. Her voice cracked as she called out to Frank, her hands groping through the darkness in search of him. "Frank, are you here? Frank!" Her voice seemed to fall flat, swallowed by the void as though sound itself had no place here. A few agonizing seconds passed before she felt his hand close around hers, steady but trembling. "I'm here," Frank whispered, though his voice sounded distant, almost disembodied. "I don't know where we are, but we're together." Their relief was short-lived. The ground, or whatever they were standing on, began to shift beneath them, undulating in slow, nauseating waves. The sensation was disorienting, as if they were standing on the back of a breathing creature. Sarah clutched Frank's arm tightly, her nails digging into his skin. "This can't be real," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "This has to be a nightmare." But it wasn't a nightmare. The shifting ground stabilized, and a faint, pulsing light emerged in the distance. It was a cold, bluish glow, faintly illuminating their surroundings. Shapes began to materialize around them, twisted, grotesque forms that resembled trees, but their trunks writhed and their branches reached out like claws. The glow revealed something else as well, a path. It stretched forward, winding through the warped landscape, beckoning them deeper into the void. "We follow it," Frank said, his voice steadier than he felt. He didn't wait for Sarah's response, pulling her along as they stepped onto the path. It felt oddly solid underfoot, in stark contrast to the rest of the shifting, alien terrain. As they moved forward, the light seemed to guide them, growing brighter with each step. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder as they walked. They didn't come from a single direction. Instead, they surrounded them, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Frank strained to make out the words, but they were in a language he couldn't understand. Sharp, guttural sounds that resonated in his chest like a second heartbeat. Sarah clung to his arm, her wide eyes darting to the shadows that moved just beyond the light. The path led them to an archway formed from what appeared to be bone. The bluish light pulsated within its hollow frame, casting eerie shadows on the twisted terrain. As they approached, a low, rumbling voice echoed through the void. It was deep and resonant, vibrating through their very bones. "Enter," it commanded, the single word dripping with an authority that brooked no defiance. Frank hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But the path behind them was gone, swallowed by the darkness. There was no choice but forward. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, her face pale but resolute. "Together," she said, her voice barely audible over the rising whispers. They stepped through the archway, and the world shifted violently. The ground fell away beneath their feet, and they plummeted into a void of blinding light. It wasn't like the darkness they had experienced before. This light was harsh, searing their eyes even when they squeezed them shut. It burned their skin, though not with heat. Something deeper, as though it was stripping away layers of their very existence. When they landed, the light receded, leaving them in a new space that was both alien and disturbingly familiar. They stood in what appeared to be a farmhouse kitchen, but it was wrong. The walls were too tall, stretching upward into a ceiling they couldn't see. The furniture was warped, the wood twisting and curling like the trees in the void. And the light, it didn't come from a single source but seemed to ooze from the walls, casting everything in a sickly, greenish hue. "Is this?" Sarah began, but her words trailed off as a figure stepped into the room. It was Lily, or at least something wearing her form. Her eyes were black voids, and her smile was impossibly wide, stretching across her face like a crescent moon. She held a plate of cookies, just like she used to, but the cookies were charred, writhing things that pulsed with an unnatural life. "Welcome home," the thing that looked like Lily said, its voice both childlike and monstrous. "I've been waiting for you." Frank froze, his breath catching in his throat. Sarah whimpered, backing away until she bumped into the warped kitchen table. The figure stepped closer, tilting its head in that same unnerving way. "You don't look happy to see me," it said, its smile never wavering. "Don't you love me anymore?" Before Frank could respond, the walls began to close in, the space around them warping and distorting. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the room with a maddening cacophony. The figure dropped the plate, and the cookies scuttled across the floor like insects, their tiny, spindly legs clicking against the warped wood. "Run!" Frank shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand. They bolted for the door, but it melted away before they could reach it, leaving only a blank wall. The figure laughed, its voice echoing in their heads. "There's no escape," it taunted. "You're home now." Frank and Sarah spun around, their backs against the wall as the figure advanced. Its form began to shift, its limbs elongating, its smile stretching even wider until it consumed its entire face. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, and the room began to collapse around them. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The whispers silenced, the walls returned to their warped stillness, and the figure that wasn't Lily stood frozen in place. A new voice echoed through the space, calm, authoritative, and impossibly ancient. "Enough," it said, and for the first time, Frank and Sarah felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The silence that followed the ancient voice's command was suffocating, as if the very air had thickened, holding its breath. Frank and Sarah stood motionless, their hearts pounding in unison, trying to process what had just transpired. The figure that had once mirrored Lily's form was still, but the unsettling smile that had haunted them remained, stretched across its face like an impossible riddle. It had stopped moving, yet the intensity of its gaze never wavered, as if it were waiting for something, or perhaps testing them. The room, once a strange parody of a farmhouse kitchen, was no longer shifting. It had settled into a twisted version of reality, distorted but undeniably still. The warped furniture, the grotesque features of the walls, and the pulsing light all held in eerie stillness. Frank's gaze flickered over the space, desperately searching for something, anything, that might offer them an explanation. Then, the voice spoke again, its tone softer but no less authoritative. "You've crossed into my domain now." It wasn't a threat, but rather a statement of fact, something inevitable, a truth that hung in the air like the oppressive weight of the atmosphere itself. Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke, the terror in her chest forcing the words out. "What do you want from us?" She could barely get the words out, but they were necessary. She needed to understand. It was the only thing that mattered now, as she felt herself spiraling deeper into a reality she couldn't comprehend. The figure, if it could still be called that, moved. The grotesque limbs that had once reached out toward them retracted, folding back into its body, as if yielding to the will of the voice that commanded it. In its place, another presence materialized, a figure that seemed neither human nor beast, but something in between. Its features were obscured by shadows, but it radiated an ancient power that seemed to pulse in the very walls of the room. I am the keeper of this place, it said, its voice reverberating through their bodies. I've been waiting for you. You who have crossed the threshold into the forgotten. You who have come to seek answers and ultimately to become part of this place. For once you enter, you cannot leave. Frank's throat tightened at the words. A terrible realization began to take shape in his mind, and he felt the crushing weight of the truth settle into his bones. We're trapped here, aren't we? He asked, though it wasn't really a question. The ancient entity's eyes, black as voids, met his, and a slow, malevolent smile curled at the edges of its unseen lips. You were never meant to leave, it said, a finality in its voice that seemed to echo in the vastness of the space. The farm was never just a place. It was a trap, set long before you two ever set foot here. And now, you are part of it, just as I am part of it. Sarah stumbled back, her face pale as she absorbed the horror of the entity's words. She had felt something was wrong from the moment they arrived. The suffocating atmosphere, the dissonance between the world outside and the horrors they encountered. But this revelation was something far darker than she could have ever imagined. They had been drawn into a web they couldn't escape, and now the strands were tightening around them, pulling them into a fate they had no say in. Frank, too, felt the weight of the situation pressing against him. He had been trying to make sense of everything, the strange occurrences, the inexplicable events, and the overwhelming sense that this place was somehow alive. But now, the truth was undeniable. This was no ordinary farm, no innocent retreat from the world. This was a place born of forgotten forces, an unearthly realm that fed on the souls of those who wandered too close. As they stood there, trapped in the suffocating stillness, the figure, this keeper of the farm, seemed to gain in substance. It began to take on a more tangible form, a creature of shadows and whispers that moved with fluid grace. It circled them slowly, as if examining them, assessing their very souls. The air grew colder, and the light, once pulsating with an eerie glow, flickered, casting long, sinister shadows across the room. You think you have control, the voice said, its tone mocking, but in the end, it is the farm that controls you. You are no longer visitors. You are its inhabitants now, as much a part of it as the soil and the air. And when it calls, you will answer. When it demands, you will comply. Frank's hands clenched into fists, the urge to fight back rising in him. But he knew there was nothing he could do. This place, this cursed farm, had already claimed them in ways he couldn't understand. He and Sarah were no longer just people trapped in a strange house. They were part of something far older and far more dangerous than either of them could fathom. We don't want to be part of this, Sarah said, her voice firm despite the terror coursing through her. We want to leave. The entity laughed, a sound that was neither human nor animal, but something far more disturbing. You cannot leave, not unless you understand the true nature of this place. And to understand it, you must surrender. Frank's heart skipped a beat. Surrender? What does that mean? The entity's form grew clearer now, its shadowy figure settling into something that resembled a man, but with an aura so ancient, so primal, that it seemed to defy all human logic. It means you must accept your place here, as all others have before you. You are no different from the countless souls that have passed through this place. You are bound to the farm, and the farm to you. The choice is yours. Surrender now, or be consumed by the farm in ways far worse than you can imagine. The weight of its words was unbearable. Frank and Sarah looked at each other, their faces pale and drawn, as the true horror of their situation sank in. They weren't just trapped in a building. They were trapped in a realm of darkness and despair, a place where the very land itself was alive and had claimed them as part of its twisted domain. In the distance, a faint, familiar sound reached their ears, the faint sound of whispers, of voices they thought they had left behind. It was the same eerie, unnerving murmur they had heard before, growing louder by the second. Frank and Sarah knew, with a terrible certainty, that they weren't alone. The farm had always been watching them, and now it was closing in. The true nature of the farm had revealed itself in a horrifying clarity. Frank and Sarah were no longer just visitors in a strange house. They had become part of something far more sinister. The words of the ancient entity still echoed in their minds as they stood in that decaying room, the walls seeming to pulse with an unseen energy, waiting to consume them. But the worst of it was not just the realization that they were trapped. It was the feeling of being watched, of something far older than them taking its time to study their every move, every word. As the entity dissolved into the shadows from which it had emerged, a disturbing quiet fell over the room. The flickering light dimmed, leaving them with only the cold, suffocating darkness that seemed to press in from every side. Frank turned to Sarah, his mind racing. He wanted to say something, anything to calm her, to reassure himself, but the words stuck in his throat. The terror was too palpable, too real. It wasn't just the creature that haunted them. It was the very farm itself, alive and watching, feeding off their fear. They moved instinctively, walking away from the place where the entity had stood, though there was no real direction to their steps. It was as if the room itself had become a labyrinth, its walls shifting, its floor undulating beneath them. Each step they took seemed to take them deeper into its web, as though the very house had eyes that followed them, that analyzed their every breath. The whispers, faint at first, began to grow louder, like a chorus of voices speaking in an ancient, incomprehensible language. "Do you hear that?" Sarah's voice broke the silence, but it was trembling, almost as though she feared the answer. Frank nodded, but the sound she referred to wasn't just coming from the walls. It was coming from the very air around them, whispering with an urgency that they could not escape. The whispers intensified as they ventured deeper into the farmhouse. It wasn't just the walls that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. It was everything. The wooden beams overhead groaned as if straining against an unseen pressure. The floorboards creaked, and even the air seemed to hum with life, thick with the oppressive weight of something unseen. The house, or whatever it had become, was alive in a way that defied logic. Frank couldn't help but feel that the building was watching them, taking pleasure in their growing fear. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said, her voice desperate. She reached for the door, but as her hand touched the handle, a low, guttural growl reverberated through the room. It wasn't from the entity. It wasn't even from any living thing. It was a sound that came from the walls themselves, as though the structure of the farmhouse had become something else entirely. Frank pulled her away from the door, his heart racing. "We can't leave. Don't you see? This place, it won't let us." Before she could respond, the room seemed to warp again. The walls twisted and contorted, their surfaces rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond. And then, the whispers rose into a cacophony of voices, louder and more urgent, though the words were still beyond their comprehension. The walls now appeared to breathe in time with the sounds, expanding and contracting as though they were alive. Sarah stumbled back, clutching Frank's arm. "We need to get out of here. Now!" But it was already too late. The whispers, once incomprehensible, now seemed to form a singular message, repeating over and over again in a language that, though alien, sounded almost familiar. The words filled the room, echoing in their minds, not through their ears. "Surrender, surrender. You are ours." Frank's blood ran cold. He could feel the presence of something watching him, something far beyond the entity that had confronted them earlier. The very walls of the farmhouse had become a reflection of the darkness that had consumed it, a malevolent force that sought to bind them to this place, to absorb their very essence into its twisted being. The room seemed to constrict, the walls inching closer, pressing against them with a suffocating force. It was as if the house was hungry, ravenous for their fear, for their souls. Frank gripped Sarah's hand tighter, his mind spinning. They couldn't escape. There was no way out. The farmhouse was no longer just a structure. It was a prison, a living, breathing entity that sought to devour them. And then, just as they thought the walls would collapse on them, the whispers stopped. The oppressive silence returned, but it was far more unnerving than the cacophony that had preceded it. Frank felt the weight of the silence, a pressure that crushed down on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He glanced at Sarah, her face pale with terror, her eyes wide with the same realization that had dawned on him. The house wasn't just a place, it was a being that thrived on fear and suffering, a being that had existed long before they had arrived and would continue to exist long after they were gone. It was a place that swallowed souls, twisting them into part of its eternal hunger. With a sudden, violent jolt, the room shifted again, the walls separating and reshaping themselves. The farmhouse seemed to expand and contract, as though it were breathing, pulsing with some dark, primal force. Frank and Sarah stood frozen, unable to move, as the building around them continued to shift, the very structure of the house unraveling before their eyes. And then a low voice whispered from the depths of the shadows, a voice that was no longer human, no longer even close to being anything that resembled life. It was the voice of the farmhouse itself, of the being that had claimed it. "You belong to me now." Frank's vision blurred as the shadows closed in around them, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. They were no longer part of the world they had known. They had crossed into something far older, far darker. And now, they were part of the farm, just as the entity had claimed. But as the darkness closed in, something else stirred. In the far reaches of the farmhouse, far beyond where Frank and Sarah stood, a light flickered. It was dim and fleeting, but it was there, a sign of hope. Or perhaps something far more dangerous, something that could either offer them salvation or doom them to a fate worse than death. The choice, whatever it was, would soon be theirs to make. In the stillness of the farmhouse, where shadows stretched unnaturally long and the air seemed thick with dread, Frank and Sarah found themselves at a crossroads between despair and a strange, almost absurd hope. The walls still trembled. The floor seemed to sigh underfoot, but the faint flicker of light in the far distance, the one they had seen just before the darkness closed in around them, held a peculiar allure. For a brief moment, they were able to tear their eyes away from the suffocating atmosphere of the farmhouse and look towards something that might promise escape. But what was that light? Was it the last flicker of life before they were consumed, or something else? Frank had a difficult time distinguishing between reality and the hallucinations brought on by their terror. The farmhouse had already proven to be a place of illusions, a place where the lines between what was real and what was not could be erased in an instant. So why, then, did the light still draw them in, urging them to move forward? "Do you think it's real?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might make the light disappear. She was trembling, not just from the cold, but from the uncertainty that gripped her heart. Frank paused for a moment, considering her question. It was hard to believe that anything in this place could be trusted, but instinct, the same survival instinct that had kept him moving despite the nightmare surrounding them, drove him to nod. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it's all we have right now." They moved cautiously toward the light, their steps slow and deliberate, as though the farmhouse itself might reach out to drag them back into its suffocating embrace. The path was unclear, full of sharp turns and dark corners. Every time they thought they had made progress, the farmhouse seemed to shift, sending them back to the same spot, as though mocking their attempts to escape. But the light remained, constant in its elusive promise. It was coming from a narrow passageway that they hadn't noticed before, a corridor tucked behind a heavy wooden door that they now saw had been hidden beneath layers of dust and decay. It seemed out of place, as though the house had intentionally left it untouched, unexplored, forgotten. Was it an escape, or merely another trap? Frank reached for the door, the rough texture of its surface grinding under his fingers as he gripped the handle. The moment his hand made contact, a chill shot through his body, and for a brief second, he felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He glanced over at Sarah, whose face had turned pale in the dim light. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of fear and desperation. Frank could feel her tension, could sense the doubt that gnawed at her, but there was nothing to do except move forward. The door creaked open, its hinges groaning in protest as though reluctant to allow them entry. What they found beyond was not what they expected. The corridor stretched ahead, narrow and claustrophobic, its walls covered in peeling wallpaper, stained with age and time. But it wasn't the surroundings that shocked them. It was the sight of a single wooden chair positioned in the center of the passageway, bathed in a strange, ethereal glow. At first, neither of them could comprehend its presence. There was no logical explanation for why a solitary chair would sit in such a place. It was as if it had been placed there for them, an invitation to sit and wait, or worse, to be consumed. The very stillness of the chair suggested that it had been there for longer than they had been in the house, as though time itself had been manipulated around it. "Should we sit?" Sarah whispered, though the question seemed almost absurd. Frank couldn't answer immediately. The chair seemed to beckon, but at the same time, it felt wrong, as though by sitting in it, they would be sealed into a new fate, one that they could never escape. Before Frank could respond, the chair seemed to shift ever so slightly, its legs scraping against the floor in a slow, deliberate motion. They both froze, eyes fixed on the chair as it moved. The farmhouse had begun to manipulate time, space, and reality itself. They were no longer sure if they could trust their own senses. The chair, however, was no illusion. It had moved, and whatever force controlled it was not benevolent. A sound broke the tension, the soft rustling of paper. Frank glanced down and saw a letter, folded neatly on the floor beside the chair, as though it had always been there, waiting for them. It seemed too deliberate, too purposeful to have appeared by chance. The moment Frank reached for it, the air in the corridor seemed to freeze, and he felt the weight of something ancient and powerful pressing down on his shoulders. As Frank unfolded the letter, his hands trembling, he read the words written in a spidery, uneven script. "To the lost souls who wander, you have come this far, but know this. The house knows you, it has always known. The choice is yours now, but once made, you will never leave." The words on the paper seemed to have been written for them, but they didn't answer any of the questions that plagued their minds. What was the choice? And what had they been meant to find by coming here? The ominous finality of the message settled over them like a shroud. This wasn't a place of escape. It was a place of revelation, one where the rules of existence were bent and twisted. Suddenly, the light in the corridor flickered, the false promise of salvation growing dimmer with every passing moment. It seemed to blink, as if testing their resolve, urging them to decide. But the choice they faced was not one they had anticipated. There was no easy way out, and as the walls of the farmhouse groaned once again, it became clear. The farm had always known they would come, and now it was ready to take its claim. Frank stepped back, his mind racing. The light had been a trap, but there was no turning back now. Whether they sat in the chair or continued to move forward, they had crossed the point of no return. The house had made its decision. The only question that remained was whether they would have the strength to endure what was to come. The air in the farmhouse had grown oppressive, thick with an unnatural stillness that seemed to choke the very life out of the space. Frank and Sarah stood in the dimly lit corridor, the letter still clutched in Frank's shaking hand. The faint glow of the chair had faded almost entirely, and the once promising light from the passageway now appeared to be nothing more than a cruel trick. They had stepped into a realm where decisions were not theirs to make, where even the smallest actions seemed to come with consequences they could not fully grasp. Sarah's voice broke the silence, her words fragile, as if spoken to a stranger. "Frank, we need to get out of here. This place is playing with us. It's manipulating everything around us. We can't trust it." Frank's gaze never left the letter, his eyes tracing the final line, "You will never leave." The words had settled into his chest like a weight he could not escape. The oppressive atmosphere in the farmhouse had begun to press harder on him, like the house itself was alive, a sentient entity that had been watching and waiting for them to arrive. He could feel the walls closing in, the distance between them and the outside world growing ever more impossible to traverse. "I know," he muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "But we don't have a choice now. The letter, whatever this is, it's telling us that we've already crossed a line." He paused, trying to process the gravity of their situation. If we go back, if we leave now, it's just going to keep following us. The house will never let us go. For a moment, Sarah's eyes flickered with doubt. She was no longer the calm, collected woman who had once faced each challenge head-on. Fear had twisted her perception, and the endless confusion that had descended upon them made her wonder if there was any point in fighting anymore. It would be so easy to give in, to stop searching for answers. But then she remembered the small glimmers of hope that had briefly sparked, an image of freedom, of light. She stepped closer to Frank, her voice resolute now. But what about the light we saw? The way it drew us in? We have to find it again. It's the only thing we haven't tried. Maybe it's the way out. Frank looked at Sarah, his face a mask of exhaustion and uncertainty. He was starting to believe that the light wasn't just a symbol of hope. It had been their first step into the trap. The more they had relied on it, the more the farmhouse had seemed to distort reality around them. He wanted to believe that the light could still offer some kind of escape, but every part of him screamed that the house itself was the puppet master, and they were nothing more than marionettes. "I'm not so sure anymore, Sarah," he said quietly. "The light was just as much a lie as everything else in here. I think whatever this place is, it feeds off of our hope, our need to believe there's a way out. It twists it, turns it into something dangerous." The house seemed to respond to his words, the air thickening, the floor creaking beneath their feet. For a brief moment, the very ground beneath them felt unstable, as though the house itself was shifting, preparing to swallow them whole. The walls groaned, a low rumbling that echoed through the corridors, and the light that had briefly filled the space flickered again, this time with an unsettling intensity. The pulse of the house was undeniable. Frank's heart raced as he realized that the house was indeed alive, in some sense, and it was pushing them toward an inevitable confrontation. The chair, the letter, this strange corridor, all of it had been leading them to this moment. They had not stumbled into this place by accident. They had been drawn here, chosen. But for what purpose? And how could they ever hope to escape? Sarah stepped forward, determined to continue moving. "We can't just stand here, Frank. We need to make a choice. We can't let this place control us anymore." As she spoke, the passageway around them seemed to contract, as if the house was reacting to her words. The shadows in the corners deepened, and Frank could feel an unseen force pulling them forward. It was as though the house itself had heard Sarah's declaration and was testing her resolve. "Do you really think we have a choice?" Frank asked, his voice shaking now, his patience wearing thin. "Do you think any choice we make will matter? The house has been manipulating everything we've done up until now. We're not in control here. It's never been about choice, it's about survival." A sudden, sharp creaking sound echoed through the corridor, followed by the distinct sound of something, or someone, scraping against the walls. The air seemed to get colder, the atmosphere denser. From the shadows, a faint figure emerged, barely discernible, moving with an eerie fluidity that didn't seem quite right. For a split second, Frank thought he saw a face, one distorted and twisted beyond recognition. His breath caught in his throat as the figure continued to glide toward them, the shadows clinging to its form like a cloak. A voice, barely audible, whispered from the dark figure's direction. It wasn't Sarah's voice, nor was it Frank's, yet it sounded like a combination of both, a distorted echo of their own fears and desires. "Leave or join." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning, each syllable dripping with the weight of finality. Frank felt his blood run cold. The entity in the shadows seemed to pulsate with a strange energy, something primal and terrifying. The decision, whatever it was no longer in their hands. The whispering figure paused, its unseen eyes locked on them, and Frank suddenly understood with sickening clarity. Leave meant death, a death that would haunt them forever, a fate worse than staying. And join. That word filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. To join meant to surrender completely, to become part of the house, an unwilling participant in whatever twisted game it had been playing all along. With a violent jerk, Frank turned to Sarah. "We can't stay here," he hissed. "We need to run. Now." But the moment the words left his mouth, the corridor seemed to distort further, the walls narrowing, the floor sinking beneath their feet. Whatever choice they had was being slowly ripped away, leaving them with nothing but the crushing knowledge that the farmhouse had already decided their fate. They had entered a trap that no one could escape, and now the only thing left to do was wait for the house to claim them completely. In the moments that followed their frantic attempt to flee, Frank and Sarah felt as though the farmhouse had collapsed in on them. The passageway constricted. The very air felt heavy with a sense of suffocating dread, as though the house itself had become aware of their desperation. Each footstep they took seemed to be met with resistance, as though invisible hands were pulling them back, not allowing them to escape the unseen grip that had held them captive for so long. For the first time since they had arrived, they stopped running. Both of them were gasping for breath, their hearts pounding erratically. Frank's mind raced, but it wasn't just the house that terrified him. The figure, the whispering voice that had seemed to know them so intimately. It haunted him more than anything. It wasn't just a presence in the house. It was something deeper, a manifestation of their darkest fears. What had it meant by leave or join? Sarah. Frank's voice was a hoarse whisper, his breath still ragged. Do you think? What if it's not the house controlling us? What if it's something else, something that's been waiting for us? His mind struggled to make sense of it, but the words felt almost foreign on his tongue. Something waiting for us. That idea was more terrifying than the house itself. Sarah, too, was grappling with her own thoughts. Her gaze kept shifting to the ever-deepening shadows at the edges of the corridor, as if afraid to acknowledge their existence. The house had been distorting everything they had once understood as truth. It had toyed with them, broken down their willpower, and played on their hopes and fears. But now something felt different. The lines between what was real and what was imagined had blurred, and there was a growing certainty within her that they weren't alone in this place. What if, Sarah began, her voice faltering slightly. What if it's not just the house, Frank? What if it's us? She paused, looking at him intently, the implication of her words settling heavily between them. What if our own choices, our own fear is feeding whatever this is? The notion struck Frank hard. The house had been a constant source of terror. Yes, but had they been fueling its power? Had their fear, perhaps even their hope for escape, become a source of energy for the malevolent forces that had overtaken the place? If they were to escape, what would they need to confront? Their own guilt? Their own weakness? Frank's mind spiraled, and he felt the cold fingers of hopelessness creeping along his spine. If the house was simply a reflection of their own deepest fears, how could they fight something so intangible? And if they had been feeding it all along, did that mean they had no control over their destiny here? Did the house hold the ultimate power to shape their fate? At that moment, Sarah's hand tightened on his arm, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. Frank, listen. I've been thinking we're not just running from the house, are we? We're running from something inside us. Something we've ignored. Something we've let grow until it became something more than just a memory or a thought. Frank turned to her, a mix of fear and disbelief crossing his face. What are you saying? You think we're being punished for something we've done? I think, Sarah replied, her eyes fixed on him with a haunted clarity. We're being forced to confront what we've refused to face for so long. Maybe the house is just a manifestation of that. Maybe it's drawing out the parts of us that we've buried deep down. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Frank's mind raced, but the sudden weight of Sarah's statement seemed to hang in the air, unspoken yet fully understood. If they were not simply trapped in a physical space, but in their own minds, what then? Could they escape? And if they couldn't, what would become of them? Before Frank could voice his thoughts, a sudden, unmistakable shift in the atmosphere made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The temperature dropped drastically, and the corridor around them seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The shadows darkened, and the walls seemed to cave in, pushing them together in a claustrophobic grip. Frank, Sarah's voice cracked as she stepped closer to him, her eyes wide with terror. What's happening? The low, guttural whisper from before returned, now more distinct, as though the voice had taken on a tangible form. It was no longer just a murmur. It was a force pressing against them from all sides. Join us. It intoned again, the words dripping with finality. The temperature plummeted further, and in the darkness ahead, a shape emerged, a figure cloaked in the deepest black, its form indistinct but unmistakably human in silhouette. It moved toward them with a slow, deliberate gait, and with each step, the shadows seemed to stretch, pulling them in like a vortex. The space between Frank and Sarah, once a source of safety, now felt like an ever-tightening noose. Without thinking, Frank grabbed Sarah's hand and yanked her toward him, pulling her close. His heart was thundering, his breath shallow. "We can't stay here," he gasped. "We have to find a way out. We have to." The figure continued its approach, its presence growing heavier with each moment. The whispering voice returned, louder now, a chorus of voices joined together in a single plea. "You are ours. You are part of us." Suddenly, everything around them began to fade. The shadows, the walls, even the sound of their breathing. The air seemed to dissipate, and Frank felt himself falling into nothingness, into the void. The farmhouse, the darkness, the figure, it all melted away, leaving them suspended in a vast, empty space. It was a place where no light could reach, where time seemed to stretch endlessly. And in that place, they were no longer sure if they were alive or dead. They had crossed some threshold, and in doing so, they had entered a realm where nothing, not even their fear, could guide them. When Frank and Sarah awoke, they were no longer within the confines of the farmhouse, nor were they in the vast, empty void they had fallen into. The surroundings were alien, yet somehow familiar. It was as though they had been transported back to the very roots of their lives, back to the beginning, back to a time before the house, before the terror, before they had come here seeking answers. They found themselves standing on the outskirts of a forgotten field, the land stretching out in all directions. The grass was tall and wild, overgrown with weeds and shrubs that seemed to have forgotten their boundaries. In the distance, a small farmhouse stood, dilapidated and decaying, its structure barely holding together. The sight sent a shiver through Frank's spine, a creeping sense of déjà vu washing over him. This place felt like a ghost of something he once knew, a memory long buried beneath years of normalcy. "Where are we?" Sarah's voice was soft, but it quivered with uncertainty. She took a hesitant step forward, as though afraid to touch anything, lest it crumble beneath her fingers. "This feels like we've been here before." Frank turned his head sharply toward her, his thoughts racing. Her words echoed his own confusion. This place was unsettlingly familiar, but he couldn't quite place why. It was almost as if it was some twisted version of the world they had left behind, warped and distorted. He took a step forward, then another, compelled by something deep inside him, a feeling that told him he needed to keep moving, to explore, to understand. As they ventured closer to the decaying farmhouse, the memories began to trickle back, not in flashes or overwhelming images, but in slow, deliberate fragments. It was like they were walking through the past, where everything had once seemed ordinary, and yet there was a dark undertone they had never noticed before. The smell of damp earth mixed with the faint scent of wood rotting from the neglected house filled the air. "It's the same as before," Frank muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to. He was speaking to the house, to himself, to the air. It's the same feeling, the same air. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, his mind unwilling to accept what he was sensing. He wanted to deny it, to turn away, but his feet carried him onward. Sarah looked at him, her expression increasingly grim. "Frank, this isn't just an illusion, is it? It's real, isn't it?" His heart sank at the question. Could it be? Were they back in some form of reality? Or were they still trapped in the same cycle? They were no longer in the farmhouse, yet it felt like the same trap had followed them. Only now it had taken a different shape, a more familiar one. The closer they got to the house, the stronger the pull became. It was as though the place was calling to them, urging them to remember something they had long since forgotten. Frank felt a deep, gnawing sense of unease creeping up from his stomach, but it was joined by a strange pull, like the magnetic force of a memory that had once been cherished, now tainted with darkness. As they stepped through the threshold of the house, the door creaked open with an almost mournful sound, and they found themselves standing in the dim light of a room that seemed to stretch far beyond its actual dimensions. The walls were adorned with faded, yellowed wallpaper peeling at the edges. The furniture was old, but not quite antique, almost as if it had been left in a hurry, as if someone had lived here and then abandoned it abruptly. But what struck them the most was the silence. It was deafening. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, but one filled with the lingering presence of something left unsaid, a history left unacknowledged. Frank's hand instinctively reached for Sarah's, his fingers tightening around hers. "Sarah, something isn't right," he whispered. His voice felt fragile in the overwhelming quiet. "This house, it's not just a memory. It's something more." She nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "I know. It's like we've stepped into the past, but not in the way we expected." Her gaze flicked toward an old, tarnished mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. The reflection that stared back at them wasn't just their own. It was the faces of people they didn't recognize, people they couldn't even name. Yet their eyes seemed to look at them with familiar longing. "Who are they?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Frank's heart pounded in his chest. The faces in the mirror were distorted, their features changing before his eyes, blending into one another. For a moment, he thought he saw his own face staring back at him, older, weathered, and filled with regret. He turned away sharply, his mind racing for answers, but finding none. Before they could speak further, a cold wind swept through the room, though no windows were open. The door slammed shut behind them with a resounding bang, and the floorboards beneath their feet creaked, as if something heavy was moving upstairs. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through their bones, setting their nerves on edge. "Frank, we need to leave. This place is," Sarah began, but her words were interrupted by a voice, low and guttural, but unmistakable. "Join us." The whisper seemed to come from every direction at once, a chorus of voices rising from the very walls. The room around them began to shift again, its proportions distorting like a fever dream. Time itself seemed to warp, and Frank could feel the ground beneath him waver, as if reality itself was stretching too thin. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. Frank's breath came in ragged gasps. "We never left," he murmured, realization sinking in like cold water. The house had never let them go. It had just been biding its time, weaving them deeper into its grasp. Looking at Sarah, he knew that whatever had been set in motion that night could not be undone. They had crossed a line, a boundary, and now they were part of the cycle, bound to it in ways they could not yet understand. It was then that Frank understood the truth of the house. It wasn't just a place. It was a part of them, a part of their past that could never be fully escaped. It had taken root in their minds long ago, and now it was pulling them back into its embrace, to a place where they would never truly be free. The oppressive stillness that had settled in the house seemed to weigh heavily on Frank and Sarah, as though the very air had thickened, binding them to the decaying walls. In the silence that followed the whisper, they could feel the weight of an unseen presence, one that was older than the house itself. As their eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement, the unnerving feeling that they were no longer in control of their surroundings deepened. They had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed, and the path forward was as much a mystery as it was a prison. "Frank, what is this? What do we do now?" Sarah's voice was shaky, a raw tremor that hinted at the depth of her fear. She looked at him for answers, but Frank found himself equally at a loss. Every instinct told him to flee, but his feet remained frozen in place, tethered to the house by an invisible force. There was no simple way out of this, no way to unsee what they had already witnessed. The house around them groaned, its foundation shifting ever so slightly, as if it were alive, responding to their fear. The walls, once simply decaying remnants of a forgotten time, now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, their faded wallpaper peeling away in large sheets, revealing a darker, more ancient layer beneath. The floorboards beneath their feet creaked with each step they took, as if the house were judging their every move. Frank instinctively reached for Sarah's hand, gripping it tightly as if it were a lifeline. Her fingers were cold and trembling, but she didn't pull away. There was a strange comfort in their shared fear, a reminder that they weren't facing this alone. Together, they might stand a chance, though the odds seemed insurmountable. "We need to figure out what this place wants," Frank said, though his voice lacked conviction. He had no idea what he was saying, no real plan, no clear path forward. The feeling of being trapped had intensified, the walls pressing in around them with an almost palpable weight. Whatever had been unleashed here was not just tied to the house. It was tied to them, to something deep in their shared past. As they stood there, trying to make sense of the surreal nightmare they had walked into, the low hum that had once filled the room returned. This time, it was louder, almost deafening, reverberating through the floor and up into their bones. The walls seemed to ripple, their surfaces warping and shifting, like the fabric of reality itself was coming apart. Frank looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the noise, but there was nothing, only the ever-present distortion closing in on them. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the far wall, a dark shape that flickered in and out of existence. It wasn't human, nor was it animal. It was something in between, something formless and insidious, flickering like a damaged film reel. Sarah gasped and stumbled backward, her hand pulling away from Frank's in shock. Her eyes were wide with terror as she pointed toward the shifting shape. "Did you see that? What is it?" Her voice cracked with the rawness of her fear, but Frank couldn't answer. His own throat felt dry, his pulse quickening. The shadow loomed larger, taking form in a way that defied logic. But it wasn't the shape itself that frightened him the most. It was the growing certainty that this entity was aware of them, that it was waiting for them to make the next move. The hum grew louder, now accompanied by a series of harsh whispers, indistinguishable voices rising from the very walls. It felt as though 1,000 secrets were being shared at once, all of them meant for their ears alone. And then, as quickly as it had started, the sound abruptly stopped, leaving nothing but an unsettling silence in its wake. Frank and Sarah stood frozen, their breath shallow, waiting for the next move, the next sign of what was to come. The air in the room seemed to shift, becoming colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, as though they had stepped into a tomb. Frank could see his breath now, the misty exhale hanging in the air before him like a warning. His mind raced as he tried to process the situation, but the pieces weren't fitting together. Why had they been brought here? What was the connection between them and this house, this place that seemed so insistent on keeping them? "Frank," Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "This house, it's trying to show us something, isn't it? It's trying to tell us something." Frank turned to her, his eyes wide with realization. The words she had spoken echoed in his mind, and suddenly it all clicked. This wasn't just about the house. This was about them, about something that had happened long before they even set foot on the property. Something that had been buried, forgotten, and now resurfaced, demanding to be faced. The house wasn't just a place. It was a mirror, a reflection of their past, twisted and contorted into something unrecognizable. "Yes," Frank said slowly, the weight of the truth settling on his shoulders. "We're not here by accident. We've been here before, Sarah. This is where it all started." Sarah's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the wall to steady herself. "What do you mean? What happened here?" Frank's mind reeled as he tried to piece together the fragmented memories, the fleeting images that had danced at the edge of his consciousness. It wasn't just a house. It was the place of their origin, the place where their lives had intertwined long ago. But it had been erased, covered up, buried beneath layers of time. The house had been forgotten, its purpose lost, but now it had awakened, and it was pulling them back in. Whatever they had left behind was calling them home. The realization was chilling, and yet, as the weight of it pressed down on him, Frank knew that they couldn't simply leave. They couldn't just walk away from the past, no matter how terrifying it had become. The house, the shadows, the whispers, they were all a part of something bigger, something that had been set into motion long before they even understood its significance. And with that understanding came the terrible truth. They were no longer just visitors. They were part of the house, part of the story that had been written long before their arrival. The past had come for them, and now it would not let them go. The revelation that the house was not just a place, but a mirror to their past, had shaken Frank to his core. He felt as though he had stepped into a waking nightmare where the lines between memory and reality blurred. Every corner of the house seemed to breathe with a life of its own, a life that was tied to him and Sarah in ways he couldn't yet understand. The house, with its dark secrets and shifting shadows, had become both a prison and a revelation, a place where the past was not just remembered, but reanimated. The once familiar hallways now felt like a labyrinth of haunting memories, each room containing pieces of a history he thought had been buried long ago. Frank's heart raced as he turned to Sarah, his thoughts colliding in a frenzy of fear and confusion. "We can't leave," he said, the weight of his words settling like a heavy stone in the pit of his stomach. "It's not over. We're tied to this place. We've always been tied to it." Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear as she processed his words. "What are you talking about? What happened here? What do you mean we've always been tied to it?" She took a step back, her voice trembling with the gravity of the moment. Frank opened his mouth to explain, but the words felt stuck in his throat. He wanted to tell her everything, to make her understand what was happening, but the memories, the fragmented pieces of a past that had been hidden from them, came crashing in all at once. He saw flashes of a time long ago, a place far removed from the crumbling walls of this house. And yet, it was all here, buried beneath the surface. The house wasn't just a home. It was a repository for the darkest moments of their lives, a place where their choices and mistakes had been etched into the very foundation. It was as if the house had absorbed everything, the laughter, the pain, the regrets. Frank could feel it now, the pulse of the house beneath his feet, the walls whispering secrets he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. He remembered something, a name, a figure from his past that he had tried to forget. But the memory was fleeting, slipping away from his grasp like sand through his fingers. "I don't know how to explain it," Frank said, his voice strained. "But I think we're not just here because of the house. We're here because of something we did, something we left behind. It's all coming back, and I don't think we can stop it." Sarah stepped closer, her hand reaching for his, and for a moment, he allowed himself the comfort of her touch. But even that felt like a fleeting reprieve. They were no longer simply guests in this house. They were part of its story, and whatever had been set in motion all those years ago had returned, demanding their attention. "What do we leave behind?" Sarah asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "What could we have possibly done to make this place remember us like this?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. The house itself seemed to close in around them, its walls vibrating with a low hum that had once been almost imperceptible, but now felt suffocating. Frank could almost hear the house speaking to him, its voice carried through the very floorboards beneath his feet. It wasn't just an echo. It was a summons, a call to face the past, to confront whatever it was that had been buried here. And then it hit him, the name, the figure he had glimpsed in his fleeting memories. His mind, in its panic, had pushed the memory aside, but now it came rushing back with a clarity that felt almost unnatural. The name was Evelyn. Evelyn, someone important, someone tied to everything that had happened here. But how was she connected? Frank felt his pulse quicken as he tried to piece it together. I think Evelyn is the key," Frank murmured, almost to himself. Sarah looked at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Evelyn? Who is she?" "Frank, what do you remember?" Sarah's voice was tinged with desperation, and Frank could feel her need for answers as strongly as his own. But the more he thought about it, the less certain he became. Evelyn was a name from his past, but she was also something more. Was she a victim of the house? Was she part of the reason it had become what it was today? Frank didn't know, but he knew that whatever role she played, it was critical. He had to find out more. He had to understand how she was tied to all of this. The house shifted again, its walls groaning in protest, as if it were reacting to Frank's thoughts. The low hum had returned, growing louder, more insistent. Frank's head throbbed with the pressure, and his vision blurred for a moment. The past was closing in on him, and it felt like the house itself was trying to show him something. Something he had forgotten, something he wasn't ready to face. But there was no turning back. He and Sarah were caught in the web of the house's history now, and if they were ever going to escape, they needed to understand what had happened, what had been lost. They needed to confront the echoes of the forgotten. The hum of the house grew deafening, and suddenly, Frank knew what he had to do. They needed to go deeper into the house, into its heart. There, they would find the answers that would either free them or damn them forever. Taking Sarah's hand, Frank led her down the darkened hall toward the heart of the house. The shadows seemed to grow longer with each step they took, stretching into the corners of the rooms like specters waiting to claim them. But they had no choice. The house was alive, and it was calling them to uncover its darkest secrets. And so, with each step, they ventured deeper into the past, unraveling the threads of a forgotten history, and with it the twisted fate that awaited them. As Frank and Sarah made their way deeper into the house, the very air seemed to grow heavier. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as if the house itself were waiting for them to make a move, to unlock the final pieces of its dreadful mystery. The creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet sounded almost deliberate, the groans of the house like whispers urging them onward. With each step, Frank could feel the weight of something ancient pressing down upon him, something that had been waiting for them to return. The hallway they now walked down was unlike any they had seen before. The walls, once ordinary and worn, had transformed. They were now covered in strange, intricate carvings, symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. At first, Frank thought they were merely a trick of his eyes, but as they drew closer, he realized that these symbols were deliberate and disturbing. The shapes twisted and writhed as if they were alive, pulsating with a rhythm that mirrored his own frantic heartbeat. Sarah, too, seemed unnerved, her gaze flicking nervously between the carvings as they passed. "What are these?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Frank had no answer, but deep down, he felt a gnawing sense of familiarity. The symbols, though alien, seemed connected to something he should have remembered. Maybe they had been carved long ago, perhaps even by Evelyn herself. The idea of her involvement in the house's history felt more and more likely as the silence between them stretched. Evelyn. She was no longer just a name from his past. She was the missing link, the key to unraveling the house's terrible secret. They reached the end of the hallway and stood before a door that Frank had not seen before. It was larger than the others, imposing in its simplicity. Made of dark oak, it appeared untouched by time, its surface smooth and unmarred. Yet there was something about it, something in the way that would seem to absorb the light, that made Frank's skin crawl. The door felt like a boundary, one that had been guarding something far worse than what lay beyond any other threshold in the house. Without a word, he reached for the handle, and to his surprise, it turned easily in his hand. The door creaked open, revealing a vast room shrouded in darkness. The air inside felt different, colder, denser. For a moment, Frank hesitated, but then Sarah stepped forward, her hand finding his. They were no longer just witnesses to the horrors of the house. They were part of it. Whatever awaited them in that room, they would face it together. The room was enormous, its far walls lost in shadow. At first, Frank could make out little more than the faintest outlines of furniture and objects scattered across the floor. But as they entered, the room seemed to come alive. A soft, eerie glow began to illuminate the space, revealing an old, decrepit altar at the center of the room. Surrounding it were strange objects, candles that flickered despite no apparent flame, tattered books stacked high, and at the far end, a large, cracked mirror. The mirror stood ominously against the wall, its surface reflecting not just the room, but something beyond it, something that Frank could not understand. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she approached the altar. The objects on it seemed almost ritualistic in nature, and the feeling of dread that washed over Frank was overwhelming. It was as if the room itself had been waiting for them, waiting for the moment when they would arrive, when the cycle would begin anew. The air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, and Frank's skin prickled with the sensation that something, or someone, was watching them. The mirror, which had been so still moments before, now rippled like water disturbed by a stone. A figure appeared within it, distorted at first, then more defined. It was a woman, her features hazy, but Frank recognized her immediately. It was Evelyn. His heart skipped a beat. How could it be her? Was this some sort of illusion? But no, there was no denying it. The face in the mirror was unmistakably hers. But what had she become? Her once bright eyes were now hollow, dark as though consumed by the very shadows that filled the room. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Yet, Frank could hear her voice in his mind, a whisper that was both a command and a warning. "Do you remember now?" Her voice echoed in his thoughts, sharp and accusing. "Do you remember what you did?" The words cut through him like a knife. The memories rushed back in a flood, faint at first, then overwhelming. He remembered the ritual. He remembered the mistakes they had made. He remembered the darkness that had followed them ever since. Sarah, who had been standing motionless beside him, now recoiled. "What is this? What's happening?" Her voice was filled with both terror and confusion. But Frank could not respond. He was trapped in the memory of that night, trapped in the ritual that had sealed their fate. He had been the one to initiate it. He had thought it would give them power, control over the things they could not see, the things that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. But in doing so, he had opened a door that could not be closed. They had invited something terrible into the world, and now it had come to claim them. The figure of Evelyn in the mirror smiled. No, it grinned. And in that grin, Frank saw the truth. Evelyn was not just a victim. She was part of the curse. She had been the catalyst, the force that bound the house to the land, and now she was its gatekeeper. The ground beneath them trembled, and Frank felt the room shift as though the very foundation of the house was buckling under the weight of its own history. The mirror rippled once more, and Evelyn's face twisted, distorting into something monstrous. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her voice rang in Frank's ears, not just a whisper now, but a command that echoed through every fiber of his being. "Now you will understand," she said, her words like poison seeping into his soul. "Now you will see what you have brought upon yourself." And as the room darkened around them, as the air grew cold and suffocating, Frank knew that they had crossed a line from which there would be no return. They were not just trapped in the house. They were part of it, part of the curse that had never been meant to be broken. The house was no longer merely a structure of wood and stone. It had become something alive, breathing and shifting with a will of its own. Frank and Sarah stood frozen in the room, their minds struggling to comprehend the enormity of the revelation. Evelyn's face, contorted in the mirror, had vanished, but her words lingered in the air like an ominous presence. The weight of her final command pressed down on them, smothering their thoughts. The darkness that had once seemed distant now felt intimately close, as if it had wrapped itself around their very souls. The ground beneath their feet trembled again, this time more violently, as if the house itself were trying to expel them. The cold was unbearable, biting into their skin like shards of ice. Frank's breath came in shallow gasps, the temperature of the room dropping rapidly. The altar, once an imposing and eerie centerpiece, now seemed to pulsate with an otherworldly energy. It was as though the very rituals that had been performed here centuries ago had once again begun, and Frank and Sarah were nothing more than pawns in a game far beyond their understanding. As Frank's eyes darted around the room, trying to make sense of his surroundings, he noticed something he had missed earlier, something in the far corner of the room. A shadow. It flickered in the dim light, but as his gaze fixed on it, the shadow seemed to grow, solidifying into a figure. Frank's heart pounded in his chest as the shape became clearer. It was not Evelyn, nor was it human. It was a twisted amalgamation of shadow and substance, its form ever-shifting, a grotesque parody of a person. Sarah, too, saw it now, and she clutched Frank's arm, her face pale with terror. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" Frank didn't have an answer, But he knew one thing with terrible clarity. They were no longer alone in this house. The darkness that had haunted the walls for so long had found its shape, and it was not content with simply watching them. It was hungry. The figure in the corner lurched forward, its movements unnatural, jerking as though it were made of broken bones. Frank instinctively took a step back, but Sarah held him steady, her grip unyielding. "We need to leave," she said, her voice urgent but tinged with desperation. Frank nodded, but deep down, he knew they couldn't leave. Not yet. There was something they had to understand, something they had to face before they could ever hope to escape. The house would not let them go until they paid the price. The figure was moving closer now, its form taking on a more defined shape, though its features were indistinguishable. It was as though the creature was not merely a physical presence, but a manifestation of the house's twisted soul. Frank's mind raced. The rituals, the dark history of the house, the things they had disturbed, everything was coming to a head. But the price Evelyn had spoken of was not something they could easily escape. They had awakened the spirits of the house, but worse, they had made themselves the focal point of its dark energy. What are we supposed to do? Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. She was staring at the figure now, her eyes wide with panic, but Frank could see something else in her: determination. She wasn't going to give up without a fight. Frank turned to the altar, trying to recall the details of the ritual that had gone wrong all those years ago. He had been too young, too naive to understand what they were doing back then. He had been led by a misguided sense of adventure, by the promise of power and knowledge. But now he understood that the true cost of that knowledge was far greater than he could have imagined. It wasn't power they had summoned, but an insatiable hunger, an ancient evil that had been bound to the land for centuries. The figure was almost upon them now. Its form shifted once again, this time expanding into a swirling mass of darkness, its tendrils reaching for them like the claws of a great beast. Frank felt the air grow thick, suffocating, as the creature's presence filled the room. In the corner of his mind, he heard Evelyn's voice once more, not in whispers but in full, unholy clarity. "You can never leave," she intoned, her voice full of malice. "You have already chosen your fate. The house will claim you, just as it claimed me." The words struck Frank like a blow, but at the same time, something inside him hardened. He wasn't going to let the house win. Not this time, not after everything they had endured. But there was one thing they needed: a way to break the cycle, to banish the darkness that had taken root in the house. Desperation led him to the mirror. In it, he saw not only the reflection of the room, but something else: a door. A doorway, shimmering faintly, almost as though it were just beyond the threshold of his vision. It was a doorway out, but it was not visible to the creature. It was their escape, their only chance. "Sarah, we have to go through the mirror," Frank said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Without hesitation, Sarah moved toward him, her hand clasping his tightly. The figure in the corner writhed, its form screeching with frustration, but it could not stop them. They reached the mirror, and as they stepped into its reflection, the world around them seemed to bend and twist. The room, the creature, the darkness, it all vanished in an instant, replaced by the overwhelming brightness of the unknown. But even as they crossed into the mirror's world, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that the house had only just begun to show its true power. They had escaped one danger, but the price of their revelation was far from paid. There were more twists, more horrors awaiting them on the other side, and Frank knew they would not be free until they had confronted everything the house had to offer. The mirror shattered, not with a violent crash, but with an eerie, ethereal sound, as if the very fabric of reality had torn open. Frank and Sarah fell to the ground in a heap, disoriented by the sudden change in environment. What they had expected was not the serene, quiet escape they had hoped for. Instead, they found themselves in a place that felt at once familiar and entirely alien. It was as if they had stepped into another dimension altogether, one that was built from the very essence of the house itself, an echo of its malevolent power. Frank pushed himself up, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of their surroundings. The air was thick with a palpable sense of foreboding, The walls of the space they were in stretching endlessly into the horizon. The ground beneath them was cold and hard, and the only light came from an ominous glow that seemed to pulse from the far distance. It was like they had been transported to the heart of the house's darkness, where the boundaries between life and death had no meaning. Sarah stood up beside him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She reached for his hand instinctively, her grip tight, as if she feared the very ground would swallow them whole. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice a mere whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile illusion around them. Frank didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they were no longer in the house, and yet they had not escaped it. The house had followed them, and now it was shaping this new reality around them, its influence spreading like a virus through the very fabric of the world. It was the final stage of its control, and they were trapped at the center of it all. As they moved through the space, the oppressive silence was broken only by the faint sound of whispers. Low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and Frank couldn't help but feel as though they were walking through the aftermath of some ancient, forgotten ritual. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, as if the entire place was alive, breathing, waiting. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Frank nodded, but the realization that the whispers weren't just figments of his imagination made his stomach churn. The house, or whatever this place had become, was trying to communicate, to drag them deeper into its web. The thing they had tried to outrun had only just begun to show its true power. It was then that Frank realized the terrible truth. There was no escape. The house had never truly been confined to its physical form. It was not just a building, not merely a place, but a presence, an ancient force that had been tied to this land for longer than anyone could understand. The rituals that had once been performed in its walls were not merely for summoning. They were for binding, for creating a conduit between realms. Frank and Sarah had unwittingly crossed that boundary when they entered the house, and now they were trapped in the space between. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled violently, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. The walls of this place seemed to pulse with a rhythmic beat, and the whispers grew louder, forming words in a language Frank couldn't understand. But the meaning was clear. They were not meant to leave. The house was not finished with them, and neither was the price they had been forced to pay. A shape began to form in the distance, moving toward them at an unnatural speed. Frank's blood ran cold as the figure took shape, its form towering and grotesque, a dark silhouette against the pulsating light. It was the same creature that had haunted the house, the one they had tried to escape. But now, in this place, it was not just a shadow. It was a manifestation of the house's fury, an embodiment of the curse that had bound them all. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its twisted form reached for them, each movement faster and more violent than the last. Frank and Sarah backed away, but the creature was closing in on them, its hunger palpable in the air. They could feel its presence, a dark and terrible force that sought to consume everything in its path. But as it drew nearer, something within Frank stirred. The realization that there was no escape, no place left to run, made him feel something else, a strange sense of clarity. The house had not just claimed them. It had claimed everything it touched, including their very souls. But what if the creature was not the only force at play? What if they, too, had power in this place? In that moment, Frank understood the true nature of the house. It had fed off the fear and despair of generations, yes, but it had also thrived on the choices people made, the sacrifices they were willing to offer. The house had been built on the idea of control, of binding people to its will through fear, through promises of power, and through the unspoken understanding that there was always a price to pay. But Frank and Sarah had learned something the house hadn't expected. They had learned to fight back. With a final, desperate act of defiance, Frank reached out, extending his hand toward the creature. His mind, filled with the memories of everything they had endured, found strength in the depths of his fear. He called out, not to the house, but to the force that controlled it, to the thing that had been manipulating them all this time. "Enough," he whispered, his voice strong despite the tremor in his hands. The creature paused, its form flickering, as if uncertain. Then, slowly, its shape began to dissipate, unraveling into a cloud of darkness that evaporated into nothingness. The pulsating light dimmed, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. The whispers faded, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air became still. As Frank and Sarah stood there, breathing heavily, the realization hit them. This was the final price they had paid. They hadn't just survived the house. They had broken its hold, but in doing so, they had become part of its story, woven into its dark fabric forever. The cost was steep, but they were free. For now. But even as they turned to leave, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't truly gone, that its influence lingered somewhere, waiting for the next soul to cross its threshold. The cycle would begin again, and the house would always hunger for more.